I'm going to try to cover two things at the same time. And one is to give those of you who've not participated an understanding of what this whole tech transfer at universities is all about and how companies get started. But as a modification, I also want to add how the history, I'm not going to cover all the history, but how MIT participated in building Kendall Square from this, how do I make this go? From that?
Wow.
Now, interestingly, this is what Kendall Square looked like, although this building is still there when I graduated from MIT.
Wow.
And now we have this. El Nado. How did we get there? How did we get from basically a desert with a lot of old warehouses, places that made boilers and ropes, to what Kendall Square is today? We even have coffee shops. Okay. First, a very short course in tech transfer. What is tech transfer? Well, overall, it would be how do you take the findings of academic research and transfer it to the industrial and consumer and medical world? And obviously, there's a lot of ways to do that. Bob Brown, who's president of Boston University, but used to be MIT's provost, used to say that technology transfers best in objects that wear shoes. So clearly the graduating student. But for the purposes of what we're talking about now, tech transfer has a specialized meaning, which means you purposely transfer the technology using patenting and other forms of intellectual property and licensing. The reason for that is if you look at things like pharmaceuticals or other technologies that take a long time and a lot of money to get to the patient or the market, here's the process. You go from research to invention. That's hard enough. But then if you're going to get to innovation, that is the research real in the world, it's the development part that is not only expensive, but high risk. So the objective is how do we incentivize development on something that might have worked twice in the lab, which is better than once, but okay. So in 1980, there was a law passed called the Bayh-Dole Act, which is still a general phrase that's used in other countries. And it was a law that governed who owned the patents that came out of federally funded research. And since the federal government research accounts for somewhere around 80–90% of basic laboratory university research in the country, this dominates how universities managed invention. And what the Bayh-Dole Act did was it allowed the universities to take title to these inventions rather than the government. And it allowed them to grant licenses. There's many reasons why that was important, but the most important is that it allowed it to take place at the local level with the people managing the intellectual property and the people doing the research being there. They allowed exclusive licenses. That means to only one entity, and I'll come into why that's important. And the law mandated that the universities could take royalties, but they had to share it with inventors. They didn't say what share, but they wanted to provide incentive for researchers to file patents. Now, why was it needed? The US was leading the world in basic research, as it still is, at least for a while. But the research results were not being translated into innovation. The US government was concerned with economic competitiveness. At that time, they thought Japan was going to eat our lunch. Now it's China, and the government owned the patents from the research, but nothing was happening other than they sat there in dusty file cabinets. Very few were licensed out. So what they said is the real problem with transferring university technology is it's very early. It's a long way from a product, and neither its feasibility nor the size of its market is known. The development's going to require a lot of money at high risk, and I'll be coming back to that. So the idea is you could use patents, intellectual property, meaning also copyrights on software, but more important in patents, to incentivize the first company to come up and say, I'll take the risk. Why is that an incentive? Because it means if they do succeed in this expensive, high-risk investment, the next guy doesn't come in and say, thank you for showing the way, now I'll do it. Until the patent expires, of course. And people argue about is software, no, are patents important to university tech transfer or university research? And the answer is it depends, because software is from Mars and biotech is from Venus. It's a whole different world that you live in. Because we're talking about, if you take pharmaceuticals, timeframes that are very long, 10 years or more, financial investment in the hundreds of millions. Clinical trials are very difficult, and even when you get to phase 3, have about a 50% failure rate. So if you don't protect the product with a patent, nobody's going to start the process, because they don't just want to let the next guy in. But it's not just pharmaceuticals. I talked about Mars and Venus, anything that's going to take many years. Superconductors. The American superconductor was licensed from MIT in 1989, and it's only becoming popular now. Large liquid metal batteries, you name it. Now, why does the university do it? Well, that's our job, to make our research real. It also allows people forget this as a motivation for investigators. But there are many investigators who spent 20, 25 years on some fundamental finding that would affect the world. This gives them an opportunity to start affecting the world, other than just publication. And of course, it benefits the university through relationships with industry. And people go to work. But everybody thinks tech transfer is about the money. If you take nothing else away from this lecture, it's that tech transfer on the whole is not a profitable venture, and universities that try to be in it for that purpose are going to lose. This is some 2012 data from the National Association. It says, hey, Bayh-Dole's been around for 32 years. We've got to see this as a mature industry. How is it doing? Well, it's doing very nicely if you count things like patents, license agreements. And remember, when it says new, it means in that year. Total active license agreements over 40,000, and several hundred to 1,000 new startup companies based on university licenses a year. So what about the money? Well, it's interesting. If you look at the total money, it looks huge, $2.6 billion. But then if you look at the research base, that is the grants to the universities, it's 4% of the research expenditures. And that's gross. That's the good news. the bad news is how skewed it is. Half of that total 2.6 billion in any given year is because under a dozen universities hit the jackpot that they usually have a pharmaceutical company or something like it. Okay, so what we're saying is that the rest of the universities are averaging 2% of their research base in tech transfer. And by the way, it's not the same 12 universities. They hit one patent that is yielding things like 100 million a year, because if you hit a pharmaceutical, well, you can calculate what, say, 4% of a $2 billion a year sales would be for that pharmaceutical. And so one of the 12 universities, they're a hero for a few years, and then the patent expires, and they're back being a bum with the rest of the tech transfer people. So it doesn't make sense to see technology transfer as a business. But it has enormous societal impact. More than 7,000 new companies around, estimate more than 500,000 direct jobs, which mean if you multiply it by the standard 3 or 4, probably a couple of million jobs, and significant tax returns to the government. And a number of new startups have developed from large successful companies, and clusters. Clusters like the biotech cluster of Boston. The majority of new biotech companies, even now, spin directly out of university research. An entrepreneur thing. I'm going to go very quickly and get out of why there's such an emphasis on startup companies in tech transfer. Basically, people think what we do, or I did, is file a lot of patents, put them on the web, go and talk to pharmaceutical or steel companies or other big companies and say, how would you like my brilliant stuff? Well, that was tried. It was tried for a good 10 years until people realized that all they got was a no thanks, much too early. So even though big companies talk nowadays about open access development, in theory, they ought to take university stuff. In fact, no. They want somebody else to invest in the first phase of development and step it up. And so the pharmaceutical industry, again, is a very real example. 35 years ago, hard to believe, there was not one single big pharmaceutical, real pharmaceutical company in the state of Massachusetts. Now, why are they littering the ground in Kendall Square now? Because of this process. Basically, the value chain. The government funds the basic research because nobody else wants to. The universities do it and file a patent. Then a spin-out company forms, and the tech transfer office gives the license to the spin-out. Here's the key element, the venture investor funding of the spin-out companies. The spin-out company develops the product, or at least reduces the risk, and at that point, Big Co comes in. That's the story of Kendall Square right now. I'm not going to go into what else MIT does. And thank you very much. If you'll give me another half a minute.
Questions for Lita?
I'm trying to get to the end of this.
I have a question because
you have a question.
Yeah, I'm always.
By the way, those of you who don't live actually here, those two buildings are across the street from each other. Al-Nalam is an MIT spin-up from one of our Nobel laureates.
My question, Lita, is as a entrepreneur, commercial side of things, how do you gain access to these, to this IP, to
Well,
actually licensing it?
you could, in theory, go into the tech transfer offices and say, I'm interested in what your people do. They won't throw you out, but what they will probably say is, who are you? What are your special interests and backgrounds? And then, if you sound really credible, most don't, we're a dating agency. Meet the professor. Then if you two fall in love and it looks great and she wants to form, or he wants to form a company, then we'll start talking. Almost all the universities have lists of what they've got. Easier even, although you'll be a year and a half out of date, is uspto.gov, the government patent office. Just put in the name of the university. You can even put in the name of the code that says I only want things in materials, and it'll all be there. But it won't tell you very much. It's really the personal relationships with the investigators.
Jeffrey, I have a question. So if I'm a Chinese or Japanese entrepreneur, I want to build a company overseas, will I be given time of day? Or
Yes, yes, there is nothing against doing it overseas. And we have certainly licensed that. Not very many, because generally the technology is so early, I've said that you want to be close to the investigators and the laboratory. The Bayh-Dole Act, the US law, if it was federally funded, says that products developed for the US market need to have if we give it an exclusive license, a substantial component of the product's manufacture being done in the US. But that's not been a major hindrance.